We're going to talk about flying saucers. We're going to talk about them from the standpoint of reporters, not as comedians, not as sensationalists. For the past 3 years, a large number of perfectly sane and reliable people have been involved in this flying saucer business. Even those of us who have never seen one have become involved. We read about them, talk about them, wonder about these reports of strange phenomena in the skies.
We need data. We need intercepts. We need photographs. We need aerial photographs. By the way, we'd really like to have radar tracks so we can see where they're coming and going, but we're going to have to write that off because we have no operational air defense radars across the country. Sign was exactly what you would expect from a military intelligence standpoint. The reaction to these very solid daylight UFO observations was the same as it would have been during wartime. I mean, literally, you take those observations, you have to assume that they're very possibly reconnaissance, surveillance, probing, and so you hand it off to your technical intelligence command.
Welcome to UFO Radio-International, investigative podcast show about UFO phenomena. And here is your host, Giuliano Marinkovic.
I'm happy to have on the line today again Larry Hancock, who was a guest in my first episode. Of course, Larry is author of a great book titled Unidentified, The National Intelligence Problem of UFOs. It's a huge book, over 400 pages, but I can definitely recommend it to any student of the UFO history. It should be on the bookshelf as one of the most prominent books, and I can say that now after I have read the whole book. And just something about the Larry in the beginning. Larry Hancock is applying formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing. His area of interest is focused on military history and national security subjects. His professional experience from United States Air Force, computer communications, and technology marketing allow him the opportunity to consult on strategic analysis and planning studies related to capital investment and long-range business planning. I guess, Larry, and it's really interesting, and while I was reading the book, I could definitely see military background of yours was written all over it. But I never actually had a chance to ask you before, can you expand a little bit more about your career in United States Air Force? I think this connection could be really interesting to listeners so they could better understand from where you are coming from.
Oh, certainly. And it's interesting. I went into the Air Force after I had taken my degree in anthropology and history, and it was quite a transition. This was during the Vietnam War, and that also helps them judge my age. And I just spent 5.5 years in college and actually enlisted in the Air Force, and because of my testing, got into the electronics career field and into communications and worked as a technician. So I don't claim any actual intelligence background from the Air Force. I do and did get a lot of technical experience related to communications, and I got a lot of training. But the interesting thing is that my exposure to the military in terms of intelligence and the national security community has come more through my historical research than it has my military experience. And I would also say that after I left the service, I continued in communications, but I got involved in some consulting activities that took me into long-range planning, strategic planning, and that also provided a good background for what I deal with in Unidentified, which is long-term pattern analysis. So I guess it's kind of a strange composite. There's no one area of experience or expertise that stands out. simply came together when I started writing about the history and national security subjects.
Yeah, it's a definitely specific mix of perspectives, and I guess all this gave you additional opportunity to use it while writing Unidentified. And like you said, I guess this military insight of the procedures, and I guess that level of experience definitely helped. That was really interesting to hear from you directly. Last time we spoke, it was end of June. And today it's more than 4 months later. A book has already been released and so on. So what is the feedback so far that you are receiving? Obviously, you had other interviews. Have any other colleagues reach you, especially from the community of UFO research? And did you get any feedback so far?
Certainly. And the book has been read, and actually I engaged with and had some dialogues with some of the most experienced historical researchers as I was doing the book. Robert Powell, Jan Aldridge, people like that, people that have been around what I would call the hardcore document research for a long time. They've all read the book. They enjoyed it. They've endorsed it. Robert Powell was kind enough to give me an endorsement for the book itself, which I've used. And so I think they were pleased with it. Interestingly enough, there has been not a lot of engagement from beyond that within what you might call the UFO community. The dozen or so people that have been involved with this for a long time enjoyed the book. They gave me comments on the book, and then many of them said that this sort of thing isn't being done that much anymore in the UFO community. And although they enjoyed it, it really hasn't been picked up for a lot of general discussion. I've had comments from people that, outside the community that are just interested in UFOs that liked it and have given me good reviews. But I was kind of surprised, given that the UFO community has a lot of give and take to it, that nobody really challenged it or commented that much on it.
Yeah, and we will definitely try to do our part here, and I think we'll have to continue to promote it because people simply don't know what they are missing. And of course, in sort of exposure that I had, I can say that I received really great feedback from the people that listened our show that we did. They expressed interest and so on. Although, yes, as you said, I also sort of monitored the community on different means. I didn't catch it was debated or discussed too much, but I guess we have to simply to continue to give the exposure, so I guess people will be able to catch it sooner than later. I do recall in our first interview, one interesting fact there was that you were also monitoring, of course, the developments and cases in the field, and you were also following APRO and NICAP, which were very active UFO groups at the time. So I also wanted to ask you about your experience from these days, about your correspondence or involvements with UFO players at the time, if you can give sort of a highlights of that era from your perspective.
Oh, certainly. And I did. I first became interested and became a diligent reader and started following the subject probably around 1964 while I was still a teenager. And interestingly had a lot of opportunity because, as you recall, in the mid-60s, 1964, 65, 66, there was a great spurt in UFO activity, some of it directly in my area. And I had the opportunity to go out and during the great Midwestern wave of 1965 to go outside and listen to real-time radio broadcasts of various highway patrol and observers watching UFOs relatively close to me. I had the excitement of watching a a fighter going over in pursuit of one of them. Actually, it fooled me. At first, I thought it was a UFO itself. Turned out to be a jet afterburner that I was seeing. But in any event, so at that point in time, I did become a member of both UFO, APRO and NICAP. I investigated a couple of incidents for APRO more than NICAP. Got the investigator's manual and checked into, again, when I was in the service, I investigated a sighting at an Air Force base where I was serving, at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas, and reported it. But the sightings that I had, again, were all fairly straightforward. They involved pilots observing UFOs, reported on that. UFOs transiting the Air Force flight line, seen by a number of people, reported on that, but they weren't really sensational. As you know, they would just be these standard ongoing types of lighted disc-shaped objects in the vicinity of aircraft. And so I reported them, and they were acknowledged, but at the time, especially, APRO was really getting into encounters, and the Lorenzens were interested in encounters of the third kind. They were looking for contacts, and quite frankly, I was giving them standard reports, and that's not what they were looking for and what they're writing on. So we didn't, other than acknowledging the reports, there was not much more to it. And I'd like to report something really fascinating, but I'm afraid the incidents I investigated are a lot like many that show up in the Blue Book files. I don't think any of them were ever identified simply because they were fairly transitory. I wish I could offer something more exciting, but it was standard UFO stuff in the 1960s and 1970s.
But it was a turbulent time, and you're definitely a part of that history. I think that's important also for listeners to know. I guess in APRO journals, which are now archived, and also I have, I think, complete set actually. I guess we could also maybe find some of your reports at the time. Do you maybe recall if those reports of yours were published maybe also?
That's interesting. I have about 2 decades of the APRO journals myself. I think I stopped towards the end of the 70s. I honestly don't recall. Seems like I would recall if one of them got printed, but I can't say yes or no.
Yeah. Most of them are now digitized, and I have them searchable. I'll definitely check that part. I think it will be interesting. So I'll try to search the whole set, and the result will came up pretty quick. So I'll let you know if I find anything. So I guess that will be interesting too.
Look for Shepherd Air Force Base.
Okay.
That would be a clue.
Okay, definitely. I will search for that term, so we will see. Yeah, in today's age, and also the NICAP and UFO Investigator Journal, it is also digitized, so we can use all these tools today, and it's really great for the research and correlations. So great, Larry. Okay, I guess we can now delve into the book itself. So it's a really complex piece of work. How long did you write this book, actually? I mean, it's a tremendous compilation, and even the notes, I discovered also so many interesting and new leads there. It's a really wealth of information. So I'm wondering, how long have you write the whole book?
It's interesting. I started, and I only know because I started looking at some of my emails to people that I were, like Jan Aldrich and Robert and Kevin. I was looking at some of the people that I was, when I first started the book, bouncing ideas and sightings across. And I actually started work on the book in about 1993.
Oh my
and the
God.
book was published this year. So that kind of gives you a feel for it. I would work extensively on it in burst. And then I would go off. As you know, I have at this point in time, I have I think 6 other books in print on different subjects. So I do some work on the UFO book. I'd get drawn off into something else. I get engaged with a publisher, and then eventually came back to it. But I was working on it, I would say intensely. Putting the whole thing together probably took me between 2 and 3 years.
I think it shows. So really, I mean, I was also wondering when I was reading, my God, I mean, how much time Larry invested in this, because it can be really seen that you took a lot of care. And even the notes, when you are looking, it really goes deep, and you can use it for extensive research after it. You can follow the leads. So I think it's a really great piece of work, and I can't emphasize that enough. When we first spoke, I only had sort of promotional material, overview, and now I have read the whole book. So I can really say that confidently. The book, of course, is starting, of course, it's an analysis of the modern era and modern military implications. So I guess every piece of work has to start from somewhere. And you are starting with the European and Pacific Theater of War, Second World War, and with sightings of Foo Fighters that introduced to the military at the time different kind of involvement with their air missions. So can you give us a little bit of overview of that situation and what kind of problems that gave to the headquarters at the time?
Yes, and that's exactly why I started there. That's a good description, because the whole phenomena, if you're going to look at it from the military standpoint, and in all honesty, I think the UFO community hasn't really appreciated how limited that viewpoint is. And there's been a lot of complaints about what should have been done, what could have been done. But again, I will say from my own military experience, you know that one thing the military does is work very hard at keeping people on task and keeping people focused on their job. And during World War II, the reason that it was a good starting point for 2 reasons is this was a new phenomena for the military in both theaters of war. This was occurring during full-scale war, during active combat, when the people involved were very sensitized to new things that they were seeing. And from that perspective, it does 2 things for us. It gives us a very solid body of witnesses who are not only experienced in looking at aerial objects, because either they identify them correctly and engage or don't engage, or they're likely to die. So it's very important to what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and they're increasingly challenged by new unidentified aerial objects. Especially the Allied forces were challenged by new German technology, rocket and missile technology of all sorts. And so the Foo Fighters came to represent just one aspect of that whole experience. And I think as we talked last time, but something that can't be overemphasized is the World War II experience literally proves that witnesses are reliable under some very demanding circumstances. One of the things that gelled for me when I was doing the research in that area was the extent to which these combat pilots and combat air crews had correctly described, they could not identify them, but they could correctly describe them. They could be debriefed, reports could be prepared, and virtually all of the new German missile and rocket and jet aircraft and rocket-propelled aircraft were described, documented, and circulated among the military forces before anyone obtained photos or actual examples of crash devices or overran development areas and collected them. And it provides you with some very objective proof that these people give accurate descriptions. So the whole idea that you have to have something in hand to do intelligence work is just not credible. And this experience proves it.
You are also, of course, giving a breakdown of reported phenomena, which is, we can say, stereotypically, or if we will give basic description, it was sort of a balls of fire, of course, with different variations. But your book also gives a really detailed breakdown and goes even further that I haven't seen too much in other pieces of such analysis. Like there were also reports of well-defined objects seen also at relatively close range. And of course, I think there was some pattern that there was emerging there. How will intelligence organizations will respond to this, and how potential threat is explicit or if it's just happening in the background. So I guess that's also some sort of beginning of the patterns that we will notice later in the UFO history and how intelligence will tackle this problem. But can you say a little bit about these interpretations that were happening behind the scenes in the headquarters and what kind of action they decided to take upon these engagements?
Certainly. And this is a point that, again, just as part of the UFO community, I might not like. But what really emerged is that they were collecting very, very solid descriptions of objects, as you say, seen at fairly close range, seen during the daylight, seen at positions where you could actually, we're not talking about lights, we're talking about discrete objects where you can sketch it out, draw profiles on it. Does it have control vanes? What speed is it traveling? Again, that occurred in many instances, and that tends to be overwritten, as it were, by the Foo Light or Foo Fighter phenomena, which occurred both in Germany and across Europe and in Japan. And so a lot of books that talk about it concentrate on the Foo Fighters as having some real meaning, where, in all honesty, the intelligence services parsed those out and basically became highly frustrated. Everybody would talk about these mysterious lights and send them off chasing them, and they just couldn't deal with it. There's not enough data. There's not enough to work with, and so they were being diverted from their real jobs of identifying and writing tactical instructions for how to deal with the new devices that were described and identified. And they really, you can see it in the memos they write. Basically, people would complain about the Foo Fighters. It'd get reported to up the command chain to headquarters. It would get to the press. There would be questions generated. It would be pushed back to the field, and the field would go, look, yes, that's happening. We don't know what it is, but in no instance that we can determine have these things attacked our aircraft or our ground troops. And because they're not a threat, and these other things are, we need to focus. And at that, the lesson to really be learned is, and you see this later in the book, is that some types of sightings are good for intelligence. Nighttime light phenomena observed at a distance are meaningless. Whether or not there is something there, to the extent that you concentrate on those, you just don't get anywhere. And that was evident fully evident, and you can see it in the memos throughout the World War II experience. But the interesting thing to me is that we get into even contemporary times. Numbers don't really mean anything. I can come up with 500 nighttime mysterious light sightings and remain just as nonplussed and uninformed. But if I came up with 3 fairly close daylight sightings, I would have something to work with. But that's not the way it works. We just tend to collect more and more sightings without parsing them by quality, and it overwhelms the whole system.
Yes, yes, and especially in later years when you also nicely explained that the whole projects like the investigations, of course, like Sign, Grudge, and the Blue Book, when we look them overall, they were focused on case-by-case basis, and that was sort of focus and direction, while what you also try to attempt to do in your book, and I think it's a really great exercise that you are doing in the later chapters, to actually analyze the whole set of data holistically and to look to the trends to see where the situation was appearing, where it was moving. And of course, if you are looking by the case-by-case basis, if you are collecting everything without any sort of correlations, and you are just going with the time, and later it was also a mess due to the PR and everything. But yeah, I think that's a great distinction. And in that historical timeline, the UFO became really harsh problem for them in the sense of time and resources. And like you said, they had priorities. It was World War II. They had to win. But very soon after that, the phenomena moves to Sweden. And you are also dealing with that in your book.
Yes, and the thing is, we see this. We do see patterns. We see some very solid patterns over and over again in Sweden, as we will later see, and in Sweden in 1946, as later in the United States in 47 and 48. It began with a lot of daylight sightings, and a lot. I'm talking about dozens, but when you're talking about you have some very credible reports of multiple people. Observations made at the same time, describing objects which are at close range, close enough so that they can hear them pass. These are daylight sightings. In many instances, they see these objects crash into the water. The objects appear to be guided. Very, very high quality sightings. But then, of course, as it occurs with these things, that also, within a few months, you had large numbers of nighttime sightings that essentially, I won't say contaminated, but again, diverted attention. I think it's fair to say that the whole set of sightings in Sweden and over adjacent countries are referred to generally as ghost rockets. Well, the objects that were reported during the initial months were definitely, there's nothing ghost-like about them. They were very discreet daytime things, flying over and reported behaving like rockets or missiles. And so to call them ghost rockets just shows you again that nighttime sightings, mysterious lights, meteors, bolides that were mistaken for these are all unidentified, somewhat contaminated the whole thing. But it's interesting that the military community, both Swedish and American and British, because the Americans and British were very covertly involved in the Swedish investigations, concluded that there was something very real. And they concluded there was something very real because they had small amounts of debris. They had some very strong daylight white sightings, including by military people, and they had radar tracks. So in that regard, there was nothing ghostly at all about what was going on. And I think that's important to keep in mind as you move further into history, because when we get to the point where we're talking about UFOs in the United States in 1947 and 1948, the majority of the sightings are daylight observations. They're very strong observations. It's only over time that the daylight sightings taper off, and we're dealing with mystery lights or objects that are becoming stealthier, let's say, and not directly presenting themselves over large populations. But a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's important to, again, parse out what was really happening over the Scandinavian countries from what's now generally called ghost rockets, because they weren't ghosts.
And you also nicely explain in your book also the intelligence games at the time. The Swedes were corresponding in compartmentalized manner with British, with American experts. So they're also sort of checking this phenomena. And also these reports have been also reported back to President Harry Truman. And at the time, I think one of the possibilities that was evaluated was a potential Russian involvement in this whole period of these sightings, right?
Correct, and not just evaluated. I think it's important for context to realize that the first official national security estimate generated within the United States was that it was Russian. The Russians were either intentionally or unintentionally launching both V-1 class and V-2 class rockets over the Scandinavian nations. It might have been testing, it might have been intimidation. There's a good analysis of that. But the report that went to the president did not pull any punches. And it was on record as saying, yes, these things are real. And yes, the Russians appear to be behind it. And, you know, this did not go to the press. I think one of the things that's very important is that everyone realizes that the military is evaluating all of these things in terms of threats. But to give them a benefit of the doubt, you have two types of threats that you have to deal with. One is, are the objects themselves actually representing a threat? Is hostile action occurring or likely to occurring? Or is this activity going to be a morale problem, a psychological problem, not just a public relations problem, but is it going to do something to the population as a whole that's going to make defense problematic? And so they always weighed those two things. And again, I think sometimes we fault the military community, but that's part of their responsibility. And I guess you would say is the closer something is to being taken as an actual threat, the less they're going to say about it.
Yeah, and this also shows certain peaks and frequencies that, as I said, you are evaluating too. And we can see certain geographical areas will have these peaks. They will start and they will went off and then they will start again. And that's really interesting part of the UFO history, and especially in these preliminary times. I guess it was still harder to connect the dots, but soon the whole situation will be expanded even more with 1947, right, as we already know, as sort of a beginning of the modern era with higher frequency. We have in June 1947 Kenneth Arnold sighting, and of course the different waves and encounters that happened after that. And of course the intelligence also again had to deal with it, but this time on their own ground. And it's a complex history to evaluate. But I guess we could start with these preliminary evaluations and how they were dealing with these first sightings on their own ground. I should say above their own skies.
Yes, that would be apt. I would offer this, and this is after conducting much pattern analysis. I think this is another place where we've kind of seen the data actually contaminated. My impression is that waves, probably, we're talking about periodic incidents, but what they're usually, when you look at them in most books on the subject, they're plotted out by numbers of observations over periods of time, and they look trendy and they look spiky. But again, there's no difference between one wave and another wave except the numbers. And it's a kind of a bulk mathematical, let's tote them up by year and see how it comes out, or tote them up by hour of the day or month or something like that. Well, one of the things that you contend with, and this is clear even in the United States in the first 4 or 5 years, are these spurts, I'll call them, are usually something like 2 to 3 months long, and then they linger on because they generate more sightings. But the good, solid, daylight, close range, hardcore sightings don't last that long, and they change in nature. And as you know from reading the book, that's hard to pick up out of a lot of the literature, and you really have to work at it to see that they're changing in nature, because the wave of sightings that you see in, say, 1964 and 1965, as I was describing them earlier, are virtually all nighttime sightings. There's a lot of mysterious lights. But back in 1947, that was not true. The first set of sightings were very concrete, primarily during the daytime, primarily of objects that were very well defined and profiled. And it's kind of amazing that by the fall of 1947, the Air Force intelligence group that was studying the phenomena was not bashful at all about saying, this is real, this is what these things look like. And beyond that, they actually set up an intelligence collection profile which said, look, guys, these things are real. These are their physical attributes. These are their maneuvering characteristics. These are their propulsion aspects. Now go out and look for this. We're not shooting in the dark here. These reports are substantive enough to know that there are a defined set of objects behind this phenomena. And we're not talking about mystery lights. We're not talking about orbs. We're talking about things that were very much identifiable. And that's, again, that gets lost, I think, in the overall history of phenomena. That as far as the Air Force was concerned, in 1947, there was no doubt it was real. And the only question was a matter of identification of origin and a determination of threat level.
And what is also very, very interesting, due to the, of course, complex geopolitical situation at the time, what I was finding really stunning, how you are also going into the capabilities of the American Air Force at the time, and how they should deal with these aerial intrusions. But you are going through this time, and you are also explaining that there was no atomic fighting capability at that early point in time, no standing interception directives of rules for engagement, I guess, in this early stage of the situation.
That's true, and I think it's one of the things that you gain from overlaying military history on top of the UFO phenomena, and that is that, again, this conventional thinking is, well, all right, you just said that the Air Force, is very concerned about these things. They, they're taking them seriously. They may be a threat. Well, okay, if they're taking them that seriously, what would they do about them? And I think it's kind of fascinating to find memos from the intelligence group to the operational side of the Air Force saying, well, we need help. Yeah, this is important, guys. We need you to assign aircraft. We need data. We need intercepts. We need photographs. We need aerial photographs. And by the way, we'd really like to have radar tracks so we can see where they're coming and going, but we're going to have to write that off because we have no operational air defense radars across the country. And again, in the UFO books that I would read when I was young and back in the 60s, it would be, nobody realized that the nation really had no air defense in the early years of the Cold War. nobody, if you were talking about Roswell or these various incidents, like, well, they got them on radar. No, they couldn't have gotten them on radar because nobody had radar. And so that's kind of a fascinating part of, I guess, the UFO research history, is that a lot was written before anybody really understood the true capabilities of what the Air Force had and didn't have at the time.
Yeah, and that's another gain from this book. And yeah, like we are just discussing about that era, at the end of July 1947, Brigadier General Joel Shulgin, head of the Air Intelligence Requirements Division, and he requested an opinion on flying disc sightings from the technical specialist at the Air Material Command, and that is where we have this famous General Nathan Twining memo, and the intelligence evaluation, and this is something that we also a little bit discussed in the previous interview. From one hand, we have intelligence requirements, which is very clear that the problem is there, it's real for them. And of course, from today's perspective, when we compare this with scientific approach and perspective with Condon Committee, these two perspectives are completely separated. They could never meet. From one hand, they are discussing as a direct explicit reality in 1947, but later the science perspective will abandon that completely. But I guess this is the first preliminary situation that they are dealing with about their own air, and they are concluding it's completely real.
It's completely real, and it is certainly a defense problem. If you kind of lay it down in front of you, at this point, in 1946, the National Security or National Intelligence Agency of the time had reported that the UFOs over Scandinavia were real and that they were Russian. So now, a year later, we have UFOs over the United States. The Air Intelligence Command determines that they're real and most probably Russian. And for the next, I would say, 4 years, well into 1952, the prevailing opinion at senior levels at both Air Intelligence at the Pentagon, at Wright-Patterson, is that at least some of these sightings involve Russians. They may involve new technology. They may involve German adapted technology. Quite frankly, some of them, especially some of those overseas, could have simply been the Russians using some of the German jet bombers and jet fighters that they had obtained at the end of the war. When you have we had a series of sightings over Britain in 1946, 1947 that the British were very concerned about. They weren't really mysterious. They were high-altitude, high-speed radar tracks coming and going over Britain. And the immediate reaction was, well, we're being probed by the Russians, because the Russians were probing Western Europe at the time. They had been probing Scandinavia with aircraft flights. And that was well within the capabilities of the Arado jet bomber of the time that we know they had captured from the Germans. So again, at that point in time, there's a lot of reason to be suspicious of the Russians and not to treat this as aliens or extraplanetary or interplanetary or anything else. The thought is it's the Russians, and if we work hard enough at it, we're going to identify it. We're going to find out what they've got, and we need to mount a defense against it. And that's the way it was through most of 1947 and 1948. But in 1948, we hit what I'll call our first political wall, and Air Intelligence determined that it wasn't German technology, and they had thought it was the Horton brothers' technology, and they didn't know what it was. And now we have a problem, because we thought we knew what it was and it would be easy to find, and now that didn't work out, and we still don't have any radar tracking. We don't have any data, and it's going to be another 3 years before the American Air Defense Network goes into place. So you start running into the standard political problem of trying to explain why you can't come up with the answer you're supposed to.
I guess in that time, first logical overview and focus that they were using, of course, that was the most potential possibility, the Soviet factor there. You have to first confirm it or exclude it to move further. And this is also the era where we have fascinating history of the UFO phenomenon and the problem itself that started. It's the official bodies that were formed to investigate based on Nathan Twining's memo. And of course, the first group that was formed was called SIGN. Later, of course, was transformed into Grudge and Blue Book. And they were dealing with these possibilities, evaluating possible answers. So maybe you can bring us a little bit of history of the first official body called SIGN.
Sure. And SIGN was exactly what you would expect from a military intelligence standpoint. The reaction to these very solid daylight UFO observations was the same as it would have been during wartime. I mean, literally, you take those observations, you have to assume that they're very possibly reconnaissance, surveillance, probing, and so you hand it off to your technical intelligence command, which was located at Wright-Patterson, and these are the people that you give, that is what they're used to. They're used to looking at enemy technology, adversary technology, and coming up with an assessment. First of all, they'll do a threat assessment, then they'll do a technology assessment, but essentially SIGN was assigned the task of identification. That always comes first. You have to identify, profile, and then determine origins. And so that's the charter that they were given. And as I said, the first part of that was easy enough. It was very easy to profile it. It was easy to prepare an intelligence collection document. It was easy to get reports. There was no dearth of reports through 47 and into 48, a lot of them coming from within the military, a lot of them coming from commercial air crews. You didn't really have to go out to the general public to get good, solid reports of physical objects. And so that's what they started studying. But the problem that emerged was in real life, the air technical intelligence groups need to put their hands on something to complete that mission. They need to obtain samples of what they're going after through combat, through espionage, through a number of ways. And as I just mentioned, they weren't able to get samples. That was the one thing that was lacking. And so they could do profiles and they could issue assessments, but they had no hard data to support it. And what you find at that point in time is frustration. In fact, the frustration became so bad that one group of the engineers at Wright-Patterson actually came to the conclusion that they might be dealing with interplanetary objects. And they actually prepared a draft, if you will, a tentative assessment of that nature and began to circulate it at the Pentagon. And that is even acknowledged in later Air Force reports from Wright-Patterson, where the commander says that some of his people have been looking into that aspect. One of the problems, of course, and this is where digging into the reports themselves become fascinating, is that they did consult some scientists. And the strange thing, of course, is that the scientists they consulted could only think of interplanetary craft in terms of the technology that they were familiar with. In other words, basic rockets. rockets, which we had seen during the war, V-2s. They were beginning to work on long-range ballistic missiles themselves, but it's kind of humorous to look at their response to the Air Force saying, well, these things can't be interplanetary or alien because they don't behave what we think rocket ships would behave like. Okay, yeah, this is true, but they're looking at everything from a very limited technological perspective, and what they're really saying is, we don't understand what that technology could be. We're pretty sure the Russians don't have it, so we're not going to give you any help. And besides, you don't have anything to show us. You don't have any hard data. So the first turn to the scientific community failed. And as you know, the Air Force would return to the scientific community on several occasions with much the same result. I think the most frustrating thing to me is that based on some really good research that people in the community have done, we now know that just as Project Sign was encountering its most difficult period and its most frustrating period towards the end of 1948, there were actually recoveries of materials from what seemed to be crashed objects that were being evaluated within very select parts of the scientific community. And on a couple of occasions, they were even brought to the attention of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson. But by that time, the politics of the matter had changed, and nobody was really interested. And the politics of the whole matter changed in early 1948, and Project Sign, which had been very open-minded, became Project Grudge, which was more of a public relations effort than an investigation.
Absolutely. It was a definitely complex era, and I will just go a little bit one step back. Like you nicely explained, when the Soviet connection was evaluated and investigated, what was really nice to see in your book was a report that they even went so far to interview Horton brothers, the German inventors of airplanes from World War II, to see that they are maybe working with Russians or some models of their proposed aircrafts were also used. So maybe you can speak a little bit of that aspect too.
Yes, and that was because some of the reports, some very good reports from 1947, even that had some photographic evidence, described vehicles, objects, call them what you will, that had a lot of the physical characteristics of the Horton flying disc type aircraft or integrated body type aircraft. It looks something like our Delta aircraft now. But it went beyond just shape of where it has no distinct wings. There were trails reported in the sightings. There were one instance over in Newfoundland where one of these objects at relatively close range was seen to fly through a cloud formation and actually appeared to suck the material from the cloud and eject a trail, and the trail changed as it moved through the clouds. This is a very physical object, and the specialists at the Air Intelligence Command were familiar with jets and ramjets and scramjets and different things. At the same time that they were looking at UFOs, they were going through an immense collection of data from German development that had been brought from Europe to Wright-Patterson. Those files have been set up at Wright-Patterson. So they're looking at those and saying, that's what it must be. I mean, this has every appearance of something that we know that the Germans were developing and that the Russians could have carried on relatively quickly, or perhaps they just obtained some devices that were already under test that we're not aware of. And so that's why it was so convincing for a period of months at least that it would be these Horton-type aircraft that had probably been equipped with jet or ramjet propulsion, and why it was so frustrating when that proved not to be true, because it really undermined a lot of the technical analysis that had been done up to that point. And it, to some extent, it caught the engineers at Wright-Patterson by surprise, because they really didn't have an alternative. It's like, well, if it's not that, then that is when they moved over to tentatively putting forth an interplanetary hypothesis, because it was conclusively demonstrated that no, this can't be known German technology that the Russians have adapted. It's something different. And if it's something different, we have no clue.
Yes, and of course, like we said, the bodies that investigated UFOs were changing, different people were coming or going, but of course phenomena was there, and it didn't matter what you do, it's always showing something. And I think for the end of this interview, we can sort of go a little bit into Los Alamos, Sandia Bay's incidents, and in further later interviews we'll go more into that in later years. So we can say, for example, that during the winter of 1948-49, local security concerns began to develop at both the Los Alamos and Albuquerque atomic facilities, triggered by a burst of reports of what appeared to be relatively low altitude, rapidly moving green balls of fire, so-called, which will of course lead to expanded controversy, different opinions, and different scientists that were involved, the measurements that were taken. This will be a prelude to cases that will be quite debated within the military establishments. But you can give a sort of overview of that situation, and of course we will deal with that with more expansion in later interviews too.
Well, and it's a good way to summarize what had happened, because essentially, again, looking at it from a threat standpoint, as Sign transitioned into Grudge, one of the issues and one of the reasons for the change in attitude at Wright-Patterson was the fact that no threat had emerged, and in fact, no mission profile had emerged. If these were Russian devices, Russian craft, the reports are quite clear that they would only be sent over for certain types of missions. The same goes for U.S. missions over Russia, and that up to that point in time, early 1948, when Sign is taking over, there had been no body of sightings which would indicate that the UFOs were focused on the American atomic complex, that they were doing surveillance, reconnaissance, mapping missions that would have focused on that. And to some extent, that also undermined the Russian hypothesis. The ironic thing is, exactly when that conclusion is showing up in the reports is when UFO sightings associated with atomic research facilities at Los Alamos, at atomic storage sites at Sandia Base in Albuquerque, and atomic weapon storage sites that were being developed in Texas came to the fore. The problem was timing, and we see that a lot in the UFO investigation, that information comes up at the wrong time, it doesn't get to the right place, and it doesn't get integrated into the whole body of study to be meaningful. And so that's the really frustrating thing about what happened in late 1948 and 1949 is exactly the type of data that Project Sign had needed showed up when the attitude at Project Grudge had changed and really didn't want to see it.
Yeah, and that is, like you said, it's so frustrating, and there are so many missed opportunities like this through the UFO history. If only the data was taken in the proper time, maybe the course of history will be different, but unfortunately, well, we are still have the Condon Committee conclusion still up to this day, and that's what is sort of I mean, I do recall the journalist Billy Cox that he was often writing serious pieces about UFOs, and at one point he was talking with one space scientist, and then while they were discussing the subject, space scientist just said, well, but that's already investigated but by Condon Committee, and that sort of was the end of the conversation, and that is what is that's standing above us, and it's hard to actually revert that and to point to the people to review the historical material, like in your book, right? Maybe even today some people for them it will be hard to understand that there was such a rich history behind it, that there was even the official bodies that investigated that. I presume some of them would not even believe that happened. But anyway, I think your book will give a great service to our listeners and readers. So for the end, Larry, maybe you can say a little bit more about your book. Where can people get it? Do you have a website if any listener would like to contact you further, and so on?
Sure, and I'd love to chat about the book. I have a WordPress blog. All you would have to do is search for Larry Hancock and WordPress, and you'll find the blog. Another way to get to the blog is my website is www.larry-hancock.com. It's Larry-Hancock, and that would give you a link to the blog. And I have an Amazon authors page as well. So again, look for Larry Hancock and Unidentified, and that'll show you. You can find my authors page, and also has a link to the blog. And I'd love to write more about it. At this point in time, I blog about many different things, but I'd love to have some more exchanges on UFOs. Unidentified is for sale through Amazon. You can order it through my website. Amazon's probably as quick as easy as anything, and it's Amazon UK as well. And of course, it's in book distribution, so you could go into any book dealer and they could order it through their catalog as well. So it's readily available, and I'd love to engage people on it, because I think you're very right. I think most people that are looking at this subject now, and new people are still interested, don't have any idea that at one point in time, it wasn't, oh, the government knows all about this and they're hiding secret space forces from us. It was more like the government really thinks this is serious and it could be a threat, and they're reacting appropriately.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll definitely try to continue to give exposure, Larry. I think this book really deserves it. The first time when I saw your promotional material for the book, that sort of moved me to start my podcast show again after more than 10 years. Your book actually moved me into that direction. So without your book, I wouldn't be again near the mic. So that's that's a great thing, and really great stuff is happening, and we have to follow it. So I can't thank you enough, Larry, and I guess we can make a scheduled interview again somewhere in January or February, and would like to chat with you again so we could follow the events after the 1949 and go more into the future.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to do that. And of course, things really get exciting by about 1952, and more exciting than I think anybody thinks much about these days. The UFO community thinks it was all about Washington, D.C. in 1952, and there was a lot more to it than that. So I look forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Larry, and sending you all the best wishes to Mountain View in Oklahoma.
Thanks again.